The dissolution of the monasteries, sometimes referred to as the suppression of the monasteries, was the set of administrative and legal processes between 1536 and 1541 by which Henry VIII disbanded Catholic monasteries, priories, convents and friaries in England, Wales and Ireland, appropriated their income, disposed of their assets, and reassigned or dismissed their former members and functions. Although the policy was originally envisaged as increasing the regular income of the crown, much former monastic property was sold off to fund Henry's military campaigns in the 1540s. He was given the authority to do this in England and Wales by the Act of Supremacy, passed by Parliament in 1534, which made him supreme head of the Church in England, thus separating England from papal authority, and by the First Suppression Act and the Second Suppression Act. Bernard argues, the dissolution of the monasteries in the late 1530s was one of the most revolutionary events in English history. There were nearly 900 religious houses in England, around 260 for monks, 300 for regular canons, 142 nunneries and 183 friaries, some 12,000 people in total, 4,000 monks, 3,000 canons, 3,000 friars and 2,000 nuns. One adult man in 50 was in religious orders. Context: at the time of their suppression, a small number of English and Welsh religious houses could trace their origins back to Anglo-Saxon or Celtic foundations before the Norman conquest, but the overwhelming majority of the 625 monastic communities dissolved by Henry VIII owed their existence to the wave of monastic enthusiasm that had Christendom in the 11th and 12th centuries. Very few English houses had been founded later than the end of the 13th century, the most recent foundation of those suppressed being the Brigitina nunnery of Sion Abbey, founded in 1415. Typically, 11th and 12th century founders had endowed monastic houses with both temporal income in the form of revenues from landed estates, and spiritual income in the form of tithes appropriated from parish churches under the founder's patronage. In consequence of this, religious houses in the 16th century controlled appointment to about 2/5 of all parish benefices in England, disposed of about half of all ecclesiastical income, and owned around a quarter of the nation's landed wealth. The 200 houses of friars in England and Wales constituted a second distinct wave of foundations, almost all occurring in the 13th century. Friaries, for the most part, were concentrated in urban areas. Unlike monasteries, friaries had eschewed income-bearing endowments. The friars, as mendicants, looked to support themselves financially from offerings and donation from the faithful, while ideally being self-sufficient in basic foods from their extensive kitchen gardens. The dissolution of the monasteries in England and Ireland took place in the political context of other attacks on the ecclesiastical institutions of Western Roman Catholicism which had been underway for some time, many of them also underlying the Protestant Reformation in continental Europe. By the end of the 16th century, monasticism had almost entirely disappeared from those European states whose rulers had adopted Lutheran or Reformed confessions of faith, while remaining, albeit in greatly reduced numbers and radically changed forms, in those states that remained Catholic. However, the religious changes in England under Henry VIII and Edward VI were of a different nature from those taking place in Germany, Bohemia, France, Scotland and Geneva. Across much of continental Europe, the seizure of monastic property was associated with mass discontent against powerful and wealthy ecclesiastical institutions among common people and the lower levels of clergy and civil society. Such popular hostility against the Church was rare in England before 1558, consequently the Reformation in England and Ireland was directed from the highest levels of society, but was initially met with widespread popular suspicion, spilling over, on some occasions and in particular localities, into active resistance. complaints, dissatisfaction with the general state of regular religious life, and with the gross extent of monastic wealth, was near to universal amongst late medieval secular and ecclesiastical rulers in the Latin West. Bernard says there was widespread concern in the later 15th and early 16th centuries about the condition of the monasteries. A leading figure here is the scholar and theologian Desiderius Erasmus, who satirized monasteries as lax, as comfortably worldly, as wasteful of scarce resources, and as superstitious. He also thought it would be better if monks were brought more directly under the authority of bishops. At that time, quite a few bishops across Europe had come to believe that resources expensively deployed on an unceasing round of services by men and women in theory set apart from the world would be better spent on enduring grammar schools and university colleges to train men who would then serve the laity as parish priests, and on reforming the antiquated structures of overlarge dioceses such as that of Lincoln. Pastoral care was seen as much more important and vital than the monastic focus on contemplation, prayer and performance of the daily office. Erasmus's criticisms of the monks and nuns of his day were threefold: that, in withdrawing from the world into their own communal life, they elevated man-made monastic vows of poverty, chastity and obedience above the God-given vows of sacramental baptism, and elevated man-made monastic rules for religious life above the God-given teachings of the Gospels. That, notwithstanding exceptional communities of genuine austere life and exemplary charity, the overwhelming majority of abbeys and priories were havens for idle drones, concerned only for their own existence, reserving for themselves an excessive share of the Commonwealth's religious assets, and contributing little or nothing to the spiritual needs of ordinary people. That the monasteries, almost without exception, were heavily involved in promoting and profiting from the veneration of relics, in the form of pilgrimages and purported miraculous tokens. The cult of relics was by no means specific to monasteries, but Erasmus was scandalized by the extent to which well-educated and highly regarded monks and nuns would participate in the perpetration of obvious frauds against gullible and credulous lay believers. Summarizing the state of monastic life across Western Europe, David Knowles said, "The verdict of unprejudiced historians at the present day would probably be, abstracting from all ideological considerations for or against monasticism, that there were far too many religious houses in existence in view of the widespread decline of the fervent monastic vocation, and that in every country the monks possessed too much of wealth and of the sources of production both for their own well-being and for the material good of the economy." Knowles was himself a monk, and this factor may have predisposed him to a relatively harsh assessment of the quality of religious observance in English monasteries immediately before the Dissolution, a negative assessment only exacerbated by, as Knowles saw it, the betrayal of the highest monastic ideals represented in the subscribing to the submission of the clergy and the royal supremacy. More recent scholarship tends towards a more positive view of the last years of English monasticism, emphasizing that the religious life in English monasteries was commonly better observed in England than in other European states, that there were a number of particular houses in the final years which seriously sought to raise standards of learning amongst their members and to spread religious teaching in their localities, that the majority of monks and nuns in England remained committed to continuing in the religious life right up to the point when it became clear this was no longer an option, and that there is strong evidence for popular support for the continuation of monasteries in all localities where they came under threat. English monasticism in the 1530s may have faced grave and urgent problems, but it was far from moribund. Reformed pilgrimages to monastic shrines continued to be widely popular, until forcibly suppressed in England in 1538 by order of Henry VIII. but otherwise the dissolution resulted in few modifications to the practice of religion in England's parish churches. In general, the English religious reforms of the 1530s corresponded in few respects to the precepts of Protestant reformers, and encountered much popular hostility when they did. In 1536 Convocation adopted and Parliament enacted the 10 Articles, of which the first half utilised terminology and ideas drawn from Lutheran Melanchthon, but any momentum towards Protestantism stalled when Henry VIII expressed his desire for continued orthodoxy with the 6 Articles of 1539, which remained in effect until after his death. Cardinal Wolsey had obtained a papal bull from the Pope, authorizing some limited reforms in the English Church as early as 1518, but reformers had become increasingly frustrated at their lack of progress. Henry wanted to change this, and in November 1529 Parliament passed acts reforming apparent abuses in the English Church. They set a cap on fees, both for the probate of wills and mortuary expenses for burial in hallowed ground, tightened regulations covering rights of sanctuary for criminals, and reduced to 2 the number of church benefices that could in future be held by one man. These acts sought to demonstrate that establishing royal jurisdiction over the Church would ensure progress in religious reformation, where papal authority had been insufficient. The monasteries were next in line. J.J. Scacebrick remarked in his biography of Henry VIII, "Suffice it to say that English monasticism was a huge and urgent problem, that radical action, though of precisely what kind was another matter, was both necessary and inevitable, and that a purge of the religious orders was probably regarded as the most obvious task of the new regime, as the first function of a supreme head, empowered by statute, to visit, extirp and redress the stories of monastic impropriety, vice and excess that were to be collected by Thomas Cromwell's visitors may have been biased and exaggerated. Nevertheless, the religious houses of England and Wales, with the notable exceptions of those of the Carthusians, the observant Franciscans, and the Brigitina nuns and monks, had long ceased to play a leading role in the spiritual life of the country, and other than in these 3 orders, observance of strict monastic rules was partial at best. The exceptional spiritual discipline of the Carthusian, observant Franciscan and Brigitina orders had, over the previous century, resulted in their being singled out for royal favor, in particular with houses benefiting from endowments confiscated by the crown from the suppressed alien priories. Otherwise, in this latter period, donations and legacies had tended to go instead towards parish churches, university colleges, grammar schools and collegiate churches, which suggests greater public approbation of such purposes. Levels of monastic debt were increasing, and average numbers of professed religious were falling, although the monasteries did continue to attract recruits right up to the end. Only a few monks and nuns lived in conspicuous luxury, but most were very comfortably fed and housed by the standards of the time, and few any longer set standards of ascetic piety or religious observance. Only a minority of houses could now support the 12 or 13 professed religious usually regarded as the minimum necessary to maintain the full canonical hours of the divine office. Even in houses with adequate numbers, the regular obligations of communal eating and shared living had not been fully enforced for centuries, as communities tended to subdivide into a number of distinct familia. In most larger houses, the full observance of the canonical hours had become the task of a subgroup of cloister monks, such that the majority of the professed members of the house were free to conduct their business and live much of their lives in the secular world. Extensive monastic complexes dominated English towns of any size, but most were less than half full. Nor was it insignificant that Cromwell and Henry, from 1534 onwards, were constantly seeking for ways to redirect ecclesiastical income to the benefit of the crown, efforts they justified by contending that much ecclesiastical revenue had been improperly diverted from royal resources in the first place. Renaissance princes throughout Europe were facing severe financial difficulties due to sharply rising expenditures, especially to pay for armies, fighting ships and fortifications. Most tended, sooner or later, to resort to plundering monastic wealth, and to increasing taxation on the clergy. Protestant princes would justify this by claiming divine authority. Catholic princes would obtain the agreement and connivance of the papacy. Monastic wealth, regarded everywhere as excessive and idle, offered a standing temptation for cash-strapped secular and ecclesiastical authorities. In consequence, almost all official action in respect of the dissolution in England and Wales was directed at the monasteries and monastic property. It was monastic closures that aroused popular opposition, and recalcitrant monasteries and abbots who became the targets of royal hostility. The surrender of the friaries, from an official perspective, arose almost as an afterthought, as an exercise in administrative tidiness once it had been determined that all religious houses would have to go. In terms of popular esteem, however, the balance tilted the other way. Almost all monasteries supported themselves from their endowments, unless they were notably bad landlords or scandalously neglected parish churches. In the charge, they tended to enjoy widespread local support, particularly as they commonly appointed local notables to fee-bearing offices. The friars, by contrast, were much more likely to have been the objects of local hostility, especially since their practice of soliciting income through legacies appears often to have been perceived as diminishing anticipated family inheritances.